Okay, let's just dive right into this explainer and unpack the widespread confusion surrounding different types of secondary research. If you've ever felt like writing a literature review is just this endless exercise in listing who said what, well, you are definitely not alone. So today we're going to completely reframe how you look at this whole process. We're talking about moving you from being a mere librarian of sources to an actual architect of knowledge.
Here's our roadmap for today. We've got navigating secondary research, the ad hoc risk, the systematic standard, the scoping review warning, matching data to methods, and finally, choosing your research path. Basically, we're going to map out the secondary research landscape, warn you of the common traps that even seasoned researchers fall into, and show you exactly how to match your research goals to the right review method.
All right, Section 1, Navigating Secondary Research Beyond the Descriptive List. To kick things off, we really have to recognize a fundamental shift in how we approach literature. Too often, literature reviews just degrade into predominantly descriptive papers about other papers, which has very limited usefulness. We really need to aim higher.
See, the fundamental problem is that a lot of researchers just act like librarians. They meticulously collect sources, line them up on a shelf, and summarize each one individually. You know the drill. Smith found this, Jones argued that. And while that's super organized, this approach really just creates a descriptive list. True synthesis? That requires being an architect. An architect builds a cohesive narrative. They position sources in a conversation with each other, figure out exactly where they agree or disagree, and most importantly, they explain why it all actually matters to the larger scholarly conversation.
So the absolute crucial point here is that secondary research isn't just a glorified reading list. It's a dedicated scientific process. Think about it. Primary research is about collecting the raw data, like computing code metrics or interviewing participants. Secondary research, on the other hand, involves analyzing, synthesizing, and critiquing those primary studies to drive actual evidence-based practice. It's basically the funnel that concentrates this overwhelming flow of empirical results into something practitioners can actually digest and use out in the real world.
Moving right along to Section 2, the ad hoc risk, the danger of cherry-picking. Let's look at the lowest maturity level of literature reviews and expose the hidden dangers lurking in that traditional related work section you see in most research papers.
When we contrast standard ad hoc reviews with systematic ones, a pretty massive flaw gets exposed. Ad hoc reviews use purposive sampling. That means researchers purposefully select papers that are useful to them or that support their own arguments. And hey, while that's perfectly fine for identifying promising topics or putting together a position paper, it introduces massive sampling bias and completely defies replication. Because classical ad hoc reviews carry such high risks of subjective cherry-picking, you should absolutely never use them to support empirical claims like X causes Y or most people have this specific property. For that kind of heavy lifting, you need a systematic review, which uses a replicable process to actually mitigate that bias.
Which brings us to Section 3, the systematic standard, 7 distinct types. Now that we know exactly what to avoid when trying to prove a point, let's lay out the full taxonomy of this systematic standard. There isn't just one type of systematic review. There are several, and each has a very specific purpose.
This table really maps out the territory beautifully. It gives us a comprehensive and structured classification of secondary research, breaking down 7 distinct review types. Notice how they range all the way from simple ad hoc discussions up to highly mature synthesis methods. For example, if you're dealing with quantitative data, you'd probably use a meta-analysis to estimate effect sizes. Or if you have qualitative case studies but you want to test causal hypotheses, you'd pivot to a case survey to transform those qualitative accounts into a quantitative data set. What if you need to make an imminent decision, like, say, during a viral pandemic? Well, that's when a rapid review, which is basically an expedited meta-analysis that compromises a tiny bit of rigor for the sake of speed, is totally justified. Each of these types serves a distinct, absolutely critical function in the research ecosystem. Take just a second to let these different pathways sink in.
Okay, Section 4, the scoping review. Warning, superficial mapping. Let's zoom in on one specific type that is incredibly popular right now, especially in fields like software engineering and the social sciences, but it comes with a massive caveat. Scoping reviews, which you might also hear called systematic mapping studies, are designed to broadly explore areas of knowledge. They analyze the extent and range of a particular field. But, and this is a big but, while scoping reviews are systematic in how they collect data, they are fundamentally descriptive. They really just map primary studies into meaningful categories to show us what's currently out there.
And that brings us to the trap we need to seriously warn you about. Scoping reviews typically fail to fulfill the core purposes of mature systematic reviews. They literally just count the number of studies on a topic, maybe organizing them by method or geography. Because they stop short of actually synthesizing the data into aggregate empirical results or novel theories, they just cannot inform evidence-based practice. What this means for you, whether you're a researcher or a practitioner, is that if the literature supports a deeper synthesis, a scoping review should strictly be treated as a pilot study. It's a precursor, a work in progress that really belongs in a workshop or a poster session, definitely not the final word.
All right, Section 5, matching data to methods, the branching path. So, if scoping reviews are just the starting line, how do we actually choose the right mature method for our data? Well, it all depends on what kind of primary studies you're looking at and what you're trying to achieve. Your path splits right here based on your data. Quantitative aggregation requires positivist methods, so you're going to use meta-analysis to combine randomized controlled experiments or a case survey to quantify qualitative data. On the flip side, if you're working purely with qualitative goals, you cross over into the constructivist realm of metasynthesis.
And just to be crystal clear on this point, metasynthesis is absolutely not just sorting papers into neat little bins or categories. No way. It requires specialized qualitative expertise to apply what are called hermeneutical and dialectical analyses. The entire goal here is to synthesize a highly credible, nuanced account or build a completely novel theory from prior qualitative findings. In fact, the sources advise that if you aren't familiar with those analytical terms, metasynthesis might not be the right path for you to attempt just yet.
Now, what if your goal is purely to evaluate how your field actually conducts its research? Say you want to point out some widespread methodological flaws. That's where a critical review comes in. Critical reviews are part of the metascientific discourse. And because you aren't testing causal claims or trying to prove that X causes Y, you literally don't need to find every single paper ever published on the topic. A random representative sample is perfectly acceptable to demonstrate an important pattern or to make a critique within the community.
Finally, we arrive at Section 6, choosing your research path. So how do we bring all of this together to ensure your next review is actually valuable and pushes your field forward?
Remember, your job is to synthesize, not just summarize. It's exactly like a giant jigsaw puzzle. The individual pieces, which are your primary studies, have to be meticulously put together in order to reveal the big picture. True intellectual contribution happens when you step away from being the librarian who just hands out the scattered pieces, and you step up to become the architect who builds the house. You have to explain what the body of evidence actually means.
So, I'm going to leave you with this provocative thought to really challenge how you evaluate the literature you read and write going forward. Is the secondary research in your field mature enough to drive evidence-based practice? Or is it trapped in superficial cataloging and subjective cherry-picking? Keep this in mind the next time you sit down to map out a research project. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep building.